Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really getting into something fundamental. We're diving deep into the core facts of India's population. But we're not just, listing off numbers. We're looking for the stories behind them, the stories hidden in the census data about how India grows, how its people move, and, well, how the nation defines itself.
It's absolutely essential, this deep dive, because really, to understand any complex society, you have to start with its people, its population, its the pivotal element in social studies, everything else, resources, infrastructure, economic challenges, even disasters. They all get their significance from the population base.
Okay, let's unpack this then. You mentioned disasters.
Right.
That's a great starting point from our sources. We hear about floods, droughts. But what actually turns a natural event into a disaster?
Well, it comes down purely to population. A natural event only really becomes a disaster when it hits people. Think about it, it's not just the power of the flood itself, but specifically when it affects a crowded village or a densely packed town. If a huge cyclone hits an empty bit of coast, it's an environmental event. But if that same cyclone hits a major city, then it's a tragedy, a national disaster. That's precisely why counting people, understanding where they are, is so critical.
And the body responsible for this crucial count, the official keeper of these stories, is the Census of India. They conduct this official enumeration periodically, like the foundation for all national planning, isn't it?
Exactly. It provides that baseline data everyone needs.
So let's get into the history of this counting.
Right. Well, people have been counted for ages, for taxes or armies. But the story of the modern complete census in India, that really begins in 1881. That date's important because since 1881, the census has been held regularly every single 10th year, like clockwork, which gives India this incredible long-term record of how its society has changed and grown over, well, nearly 150 years now.
That kind of continuity must be incredibly valuable for tracking trends. Okay, so to graph the sheer scale, let's use the 2011 census as our benchmark. It's the last really detailed picture before the big changes in the last decade or so. What was the number then, back in March 2011?
The official figure was 1,210.6 million people, so just over 1.2 billion.
About 0.2 billion back in 2011. And globally, where did that place India?
At that time, India accounted for more than 17% of the entire world's population. Just try to picture that. More than 1 out of every 6 people on the planet lived in India. It really underscores the challenge of managing resources and governance.
Which, naturally, leads us to the very recent headline news. The fact that India officially overtook China in 2023, becoming the most populous country on Earth. And when we talk about population growth, it's easy to get caught up in the percentage rate, but you're saying what really hits home is the actual number of people added each year.
Absolutely. That absolute increase is what drives the real-world demand. Demand for schools, for housing, for food, for jobs. The sheer scale is unprecedented, and that's the lens we really need to use when looking at all this data.
Right. So scale is one thing, but then there's how people are spread out. Density. That tells a different story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Not just how many, but how closely packed together people are living.
Exactly. Population density is defined pretty simply. It's the number of persons per unit area, usually per square kilometer. And back in 2011, India's national average was 382 persons per square kilometer.
382. How does that compare globally? Is that considered high?
Oh, extremely high on a global scale. In fact, the sources note that looking at countries, only Bangladesh and Japan were recorded as having a higher average density than India at that time. So yeah, India is definitely up there in terms of human concentration.
But that average number hides a lot of variation within India itself, right?
Massively. The national average is just, well, an average. The real story is the incredible contrast you see inside the country. India is almost like a tale of two different demographic worlds existing side by side.
Okay, let's paint that picture. Which state had the largest population overall in 2011? Just sheer numbers.
That would be Uttar Pradesh. UP was the volume champion, so to speak. And it's fascinating. Almost half of India's entire population lives in just 5 major states. UP, Maharashtra, Bihar.
And the others. West Bengal and Andhra Pradesh, I believe, are the other two back then.
That's right. And what's interesting is which states aren't on that list. You might think a huge state geographically, like Rajasthan, would be one of the most populated, but it's not among those top 5.
Okay, so that's total population. What about density? Where was it highest and lowest?
Right, the extremes are striking. The highest density in 2011 was found in Bihar, a state that's heavily agricultural, very fertile land in parts. And the lowest, way over in the northeast, in Arunachal Pradesh.
And there must be reasons for that huge difference. What drives that low density in places like Arunachal Pradesh?
It boils down to geography and climate, mostly. The sources point to rugged terrain, think high mountains, difficult access, and generally unfavorable climatic conditions. It's just physically harder to support a large population there.
So basically, mountains and tough weather keep the numbers down, and the opposite must be true for the high-density areas.
Precisely. Areas like the northern plains or down south in Kerala, they benefit from, well, almost perfect conditions for settlement. You've got flat plains, very fertile soils, and crucially abundant rainfall. So people naturally congregate where it's easier to farm and, frankly, easier to live. It's a logical distribution shaped by the physical environment.
Right? That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's the where. What about the how? How does the population change over time?
Good question. Population is never static, is it? It's always in flux. And there are three main processes driving these changes in the numbers, the distribution, and even the composition of the population. These are births, deaths, and migrations.
Okay, let's get the definitions clear first. Birth rate and death rate.
Simple enough. The birth rate is the number of live births in a year for every 1,000 people in the population, and the death rate is, similarly, the number of deaths per 1,000 persons in a year.
And the difference between those two.
That gives you what's called the natural increase of population, just births minus deaths. But here's where we hit a really interesting phase in India's story, almost a paradox. For about 3 decades, from 1951 right up to 1981, India's annual rate of growth actually kept increasing. It accelerated.
Wow, accelerated. And just to set the scene, what was the population back in 1951?
Much smaller, around 361 million people in 1951. So to see the growth rate pick up speed from that base over 30 years, it was quite dramatic.
Can you give us a sense of what, say, a 2% annual growth rate actually means in practice?
Sure, a 2% rate sounds small, maybe, but it means that for every 100 people you started with at the beginning of the year, you have 102 at the end. 2 extra people for every 100. Now, apply that percentage to a base population of hundreds of millions.
And the numbers start getting very big.
Yeah.
Very quickly, even with a seemingly small percentage.
Exactly. And that leads to this crucial insight about demographic momentum. Even when India's annual growth rate starts to slow down, as it has been doing, because it's applied to such an enormous base population, it still results in a very large absolute increase in the number of people each year.
Right, so the percentage might drop, but the actual number of new people needing resources is still huge.
Precisely. And that absolute increase, which you calculate just by subtracting the earlier population from the later one, that's the number planners really have to grapple with.
So what was fueling that acceleration up to the 1980s?
It was a combination, really. Primarily, you had high birth rates. Families were still having many children. But critically, death rates were starting to decline quite rapidly. Better healthcare, sanitation, control of epidemics. They were saving lives, especially infant and child lives, but the birth rates hadn't caught up, hadn't started falling significantly yet.
Okay, so high births plus falling deaths equals rapid growth. What about now? What's the main driver today?
Well, the situation has evolved. The main cause of population growth today is still largely attributed to that continued rapid decline in death rates. People are living longer, infant mortality is much lower, we're just much better at keeping people alive, thankfully.
That's definitely good news. And what about the birth rate side of the equation?
That's where the other part of the story comes in, and it's also positive, from a planning perspective at least. The overall trend in the annual growth rate has been declining since about 1981. And this decline is seen as a positive sign, an indicator that decades of efforts focused on birth control and family planning are having a real effect.
So birth rates have been coming down.
Yes, both rates have shown a pretty rapid decline since 1981. India has managed to sort of bend the growth curve downwards, even though the sheer momentum keeps the absolute numbers high for now.
Okay, fascinating dynamics between births and deaths. What about the third factor you mentioned, migration? That shapes where people live, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Migration is a huge part of the story, especially internal migration, people moving within India. Now, internal migration doesn't actually change the total population size of the country, but it has a massive impact on the distribution of people. When someone moves, it changes the population numbers, the age structure, the skills mix in both the place they leave and the place they arrive.
So a village might lose young workers while a city gains them.
Exactly, and that fundamentally reshapes local economies and social structures.
What's driving the big move from rural areas to cities in India? The sources talk about push factors.
Yes, the primary push factors forcing people out of rural areas are pretty stark. poverty and lack of employment opportunities. People aren't necessarily moving because cities are so glamorous, but often because they simply have to find work to survive and support their families.
And the result is clearly visible in the cities. How urban was India back in 2011?
The urban population reached 31.80% in 2011, so nearly a third of the country living in urban areas. And look at the growth of the big cities, the number of what they call million-plus cities. That cities with over 10 lakh population, it just exploded. It went from 35 such cities in 2001 to 53 just 10 years later in 2011.
Wow, that's incredibly rapid urbanization, from 35 to 53 million plus cities in a decade? Okay, shifting focus slightly within the population structure. Let's talk about young people, adolescents. How significant is that group in India?
Hugely significant. Adolescents, defined generally as those in the 10 to 19 years age group, they form a massive chunk of the population. We're talking about 1/5 of India's total population falling into this age bracket.
1/5. That's an enormous potential resource, but also a group with specific needs.
Absolutely. They are the future workforce, the future innovators, but they need targeted support. The sources specifically highlight a major health challenge, particularly for adolescent girls, often linked to poor diet, anemia. So ensuring good nutrition, good education, and health care for this huge cohort is, well, it's non-negotiable for India's future development.
And has there been a policy response to manage population growth and structure over the years?
Oh, yes. India was actually one of the pioneers globally in this area. The government launched a comprehensive family planning program way back in 1952, very early days.
1952, that is early. And how have policies evolved since then?
They become much more holistic. Take the National Population Policy, or NPP, from the year 2000. It really shifted the focus beyond just controlling numbers towards broader social development goals. Key things included aiming for free and compulsory school education up to age 14, drastically reducing infant mortality. And importantly, the policy explicitly rejects harmful past practices. Things like promoting early marriage are definitely not part of the NPP 2000 framework. It's about empowerment and well-being.
That focus on education is key. And speaking of education, how does the census actually define literacy? What's the standard?
It's a fairly standard definition used internationally.
Mhm.
According to the census, a person is considered literate if they are 7 years old or above
Yeah.
and can read and write any language with understanding. The with understanding part is crucial. It's not just about recognizing letters, but actually comprehending the meaning.
Right, comprehension is key.
Oh.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. History, density, growth, migration, policy. So what does this all mean when we put it together?
Well, we've traced this incredible journey, haven't we? From that first proper count in 1881, through that period of paradoxical growth or falling death rates actually accelerated the population increase, and into the modern era with its challenges of managing huge density, rapid urbanization, and nurturing the largest generation of young people the world has ever seen.
It really paints a picture of immense scale and dynamism.
It does, and I think the key takeaway is this. While India's population is enormous and presents huge challenges, the data also shows change is possible. The declining growth rate since the 80s shows that deliberate policy interventions, right from that early 1952 program up to the NPP 2000, they are having an impact. They're actively reshaping the demographic trajectory.
So it's a story of challenge, yes, but also of response and adaptation. The country is actively trying to shape its demographic future. The data isn't just looking back, it's pointing to the challenges right ahead of us.
Exactly. And maybe here's a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to mull over. We know that historically, a very young population structure, lots of children, that's usually the result of high birth rates. But as India's birth rates continue to fall and the population inevitably starts to age, how is that going to change the dependency ratio? You know, that ratio of dependent people, the young below 15 and the elderly above 60, compared to the working age population in between, those age 15 to 59. How will that shifting balance reshape India's economy, its social support systems, its entire national planning focus over the coming decade or two? That transition from a young nation to an eventually aging one might be the biggest demographic story yet to unfold.